Thank you to our hosts for having us. Real big thank you guys for sticking around after lunch in the panel. I will try to keep it quick and try to keep it informal so we can all leave a lot of time at the end for questions and discussion. Again, thank you all. I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about character assassination in the context of international statecraft. So it makes a lot of sense if we're talking about kind of personal attacks, negative attacks from the context of domestic politics. We're all used to mudslinging and how dirty and personal things can get. And the logic there typically makes sense because you have two competitors vying for a common audience, and that dynamic is fairly well understood. But what's less clear is why politicians choose to launch character attacks against international opponents when you're not vying for support of a common electorate, and you're not even sure if folks across the ocean are even tuning into what you're saying in the first place. So fear not, 10, 15 minutes is more than enough time to comprehensively cover this entire topic. No, I mean, that's absurd. So I'm gonna do a lot of hand waving at some very big issues, and if there are questions, and if I'm moving fast, I think we'll just leave a lot of that for the end. So again, I know I'm going to be moving quickly through a lot of very big things. Point well taken. We can always come back to issues. So I want to talk about three central themes. The first is how politicians speaking internationally with their character attacks, their character assassination, may have different audiences in mind. So some of it may in fact be targeted to folks abroad, but a lot of it is domestic signaling and domestic messaging, and they're not mutually exclusive. But you can take these different audiences and how they might impact political rhetoric. The second main theme is that international politics has always been negative, it's always been personal, and I think it's getting worse. We've had an ongoing theme here about relative optimism versus pessimism. I am the honorary captain of Team Pessimism. So if we need to, I don't think we're in danger of being too optimistic here, but I'm always happy to take us back and put a kind of a dour spin on things. And then the final theme I want to talk about is that character attacks aren't just an academic curiosity, they actually matter, or potentially matter, for interstate dynamics and international relations. So the first question, why engage in a character attack against an international foe? So the first broad category is you're actually trying to influence things internationally. So if you have a figurehead of a cause, of movement, an antagonistic country, you can get a lot of mileage by using a personal attack to kind of undermine the whole, right? So you have certain points in history where a leader becomes kind of synonymous with a country or cause, Napoleon, Zelensky or Putin today. And so by attacking the figurehead, it's kind of a proxy battle to attack your rival society more broadly. So we have, you know, a heroic depiction of Napoleon, a more satirical version. Internationally, maybe you're trying to undermine their support in their own domestic audiences, but you may also be signaling to other international powers trying to reduce their ability to form international coalitions or reduce global support in some cause or conflict. That said, you know, there are real limits to the impact of character assassination in a cross-national context. And you have obviously language barriers where you can insult someone and just get a shrug because they don't know what you're saying. But more importantly, at least for much of human history, you have pretty profound media barriers. So, if a politician says something in the woods, but the media isn't there to amplify it, does it even matter? And so particularly, in a domestic context, that's hard. In an international context, it's like exponentially difficult to get your voice heard across your international borders. And especially if you're messaging, attacking a leader of an authoritarian state where they might have strong state media controls, good luck getting your attack heard in a foreign audience. You may as well not bother. And the final point to consider is if somehow you overcome language barriers and media barriers, you still have to contend with the challenges of source credibility. I mean, there's a long literature in psychology and political communication tying source cues and persuasion evaluation. And if you're a leader of an antagonistic country, you're just not going to be believed or taken seriously in a cross-national audience. I will apologize in advance. I am an American academic, and a lot of my examples come from American politics. I don't want to feed into the stereotype that the whole world revolves around American politics. It's just the literature I'm most familiar with. So recently, you have former President Trump calling Kim Jong-un, rocket man, calling him insane. And in return, the North Koreans are more than happy to lob personal attacks back at Trump, calling him a dotard, calling him insane. But does this matter? If Donald Trump calls Kim Jong-un anything, I don't think it really changes the opinion of anyone in North Korea. If anything, it might reinforce his standing for a kind of quasi-rally effect. I don't know. Kim Jong-un calls President Trump a dotard, aside from some of us shaking our heads saying, yes, that makes sense. But it's not really going to change any heads, right, domestically in the United States. So is it really cheap talk? Why do you bother? So I think the focus many times in launching a character attack against a foreign foe isn't international at all. It's one of several forms of domestic signaling. So one form might be you're trying to bolster domestic support for some policy, for some military initiative. And in this context, it's a useful strategy to kind of personify your opponent from a collective down to an individual. I mean, we're all psychologically predisposed to think in terms of individuals, and it makes for a really good rhetorical flourish when you talk about an individual evil leader versus necessarily some kind of amorphous collective. Like, we're just wired to understand the world that way. And in doing so, by launching an attack against some evil boogeyman from across the seas, you can help bolster policy or support a military initiative, or basically use that as a proxy to advance your own agenda. We see this in not too distant American history when we were marshaling support for the invasion of Iraq. If you read a lot of the transcripts of the debate coming out of the White House or coming out of the military or federal government, there was a little bit of a mention of, we're going to go in and, liberate Iraq. But a lot of the debate was in strikingly personal terms, talking about Saddam Hussein as an individual, calling him, insane, a murderer, unhinged. And so, from the vice president, the president's secretary to state, you see a lot of the case for the invasion of Iraq cast in terms of character attacks and personal attacks, and not just some kind of amorphous invasion of Iraq writ large. So that was a very useful rhetorical strategy. And in fact, it was so useful, so having lived in the States during this period of history, it is really surreal to reflect on just how much of a boogeyman Saddam was made out to be. So you see what began as kind of a political foil from several different administrations until Saddam became basically a boogeyman in the popular conscience. So you have what you might see as a kind of traditional political cartoon. But he was also co-opted by South Park, a very popular kind of satirical show, Saturday Night Live. So, this character attack was so successful, he became like a grumpus in popular culture and remained there for, like 2 decades, a quarter century. So he was a very useful foil for many different American administrations to kind of personify a bad guy and advance their policy. Another component, this is also domestic, but not necessarily tied to any particular policy, is to attack a foreign opponent as a form of kind of virtue signaling. And what do I mean by this? Well, if you set up an other as the personification of something evil, something bad, something dangerous, you can set yourself up to look really good in point of comparison. So it may not necessarily be to advance a particular policy issue, but just to kind of morally grandstand and build up your own brand. This particular photo is from a very famous address from former President Reagan during the kind of peak of the Cold War, where he stands up and in a very famous speech calls the Soviet Union an evil empire, and America and her Western allies, fighting the evil empire. And it's in very starkly good versus evil terms. And in fact, there is no accident that the venue was the National Association of Evangelicals. So, if you're trying to build up your personal brand, you are messaging in a way that's signaling virtue in a audience that's signaling your, religious Christian virtue as well. There really isn't any policy in the speech. It's all a way of kind of building your brand by knocking your opponent down. So the other main theme is that international relations has always been negative and always been personal. I mean, my colleague, a historian, will take us back to Roman history, and I dare say you can go back to the earliest records of human history to see examples of this. But again, I mentioned that I was captain of Team Pessimism, and so I think these two statements can both be true. This can both be kind of a universal theme of global politics, and I think it can be getting worse. And I think this is partly due to the erosion of norms that we see from the rise of Trump or nationalists worldwide, but I think in some ways even more so that digital media and social media is changing the dynamics and the incentives of cross-national character attacks and how plausible they are to engage in and how dangerous they could be for the states or individuals on the receiving end of these attacks. So I mentioned earlier some barriers to cross-national signaling, and each of these barriers is mitigated to some degree by the rise of social media or digital media. So language barriers used to be a real hurdle, now fairly trivial with different software packages and AI to translate across languages, not a big deal anymore. We are struggling, even in a domestic context, with misinformation, disinformation, social media, new media, and how much we are in the wild and how far we've moved away from kind of formal journalistic controls, formal media controls. And many of the same dynamics tie into and exacerbate international misinformation and character attacks, where you no longer have the firewall protecting a domestic audience to the same degree from international signals as you would have in the past. And then finally, and I think the most insidious one, is that digital media reduces the likelihood that source cues can mitigate the effect of character attacks. So now it is possible to pretend to be attacking from within your subject's own nation, so you kind of lose the danger of fearing the outside. And even more so, you can try to engage in credibility laundering. And what I mean by this is you inject an attack or a negative narrative into a target state, and you hope that those themes are picked up by members of the domestic audience, and then they do the amplifying for you. So to kind of illustrate this point, I want to bring a lot of these themes together in a timely case study. Our speakers before lunch were spending quite a bit of time talking about Russia and Ukraine. And I think beyond the kind of kinetic battlefield that we were talking about before, we see kind of a parallel battlefield in public opinion and character assassination that both sides are engaged in. So you have Zelensky as the figurehead of the Ukrainian cause, and he has really very effectively blurred the line between his personal brand and the Ukrainian brand. And similarly in Russia, a lot of the rhetoric is focused on Putin as an individual and not just on Russia writ large. So, there is a tenuous power of setting yourself as the hero in this narrative. On one hand, Zelensky has been, hugely successful through his personal bravery that we were talking about before and his personal magnetism, really embodying the Ukrainian cause. And I think individually it's hard to overstate how much he has done as a brand for Ukrainian resistance and for their standing overseas. But the flip side of making kind of blurring the line between the individual and the cause is if you can manage to undermine the individual, you can, by association, undermine the cause. I mean, that's one of the core tactics of character assassination. It's kind of the aphorism, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And so he's been successful now, but it still makes him a prime target for Russia, and he's always been a prime target to try to undermine his brand. So how are we seeing the blurring of the lines now between domestic and international character attacks? Well, a quick quote here, Ukraine has elevated a celebrated Nazi in its ranks, the comedian in cargo pants, a man called Zelensky. If we were a class, I would ask for volunteers, but I will give us the answer. Is it a hand? No. So this is not a Russian source. This is Vivek Ramaswamy, who for a time was leading in the Republican primary, presidential primary. So this is not a fringe figure in American politics. And in fact, if you listen to a lot of American discourse about the conflict in Ukraine, Zelensky has been called all sorts of bad names, from a Nazi, a comedian, a drug addict, corrupt. I mean, a whole litany of terrible things. So clearly not everyone has bought into this hero narrative. But the striking bit is that a lot of these messages rhyme with the same messaging coming out of the Kremlin. And this is not by accident. So a lot of this negative character attack has originated in Russia and managed to infiltrate the American domestic debate. Now, part of this is a weird accident of the times, where there's this kind of strange, unholy alliance between a non-trivial percentage of the American right, who are isolationists and nationalists and skeptics, and they find common cause with Russia. But Russia's also gotten quite clever about disguising the source of their attacks and using different forms of information manipulation to advance their narratives. In fact, they have been learning for the better part of a decade now. These are two images from their kind of first test run of character assassination as a tool of international statecraft. These are taken from the 2016 US presidential election, where they were trying to push the scale against candidate Clinton and for candidate Trump. And so they were really very clever at using social media to have sources that looked like they came from American veterans, or on the right, believe it or not, the army of Jesus, because clearly Jesus wanted Trump to win and Clinton to fail. And so if you are an American consumer of information, you don't know necessarily the origin of these character attacks, and that's part of what makes it so effective. And then if you hear them parroted by your own domestic politicians, what started as kind of a trivial, potentially bit of cheap talk, really begins to have some teeth. I don't want to spend too much time. I'm happy to return to this during the Q&A, but there are some things being done to mitigate the impact of cross-national character attacks and the vulnerability. But I will cut myself off from now, and I'm happy to return to it in the Q&A if we want to talk a little bit about what you can do to counter this as someone on the receiving end. Thanks, guys.